every GM has their signature, whether it's an item or a person or a dungeon. In my case, it happened to be a dungeon known as the Dollhouse. The setting, to give some backdrop on it, was owned by a gnomish wizard. This particular wizard had a long history of being a well-to-do kind of guy. He was the kind of individual who would broker peace at great cost to himself, and did so between several kingdoms to end wars. He was well on his way becoming an archmage, and in local lore of the region, he was credited as being a hero with a festival in his honor. To proceed, about 100 years later, the party enters the scene, and as they're traveling through the landside, they stop in a small village, who, of course, has rumors about the keep nearby sitting on an island out in their lake. They call it the Dollhouse, and the Dollhouse is the last known residence of this gnome. Rumors abound, of course, in town that occasionally strange lights can be seen coming from the towers of the keep at night. Sometimes there's odd noises. Players, being players as they are, decide this is an adventure hook, and they latch right onto it and go to the Dollhouse to investigate. Most importantly of all the characters with them was an individual who's playing a barbarian with a great big axe. This barbarian could not help himself but to try to break down the large, thick doors of the front of the keep. The problem came with this is the player, I guess, did not understand the way castles were built in some methods, especially in a fantasy setting. So they investigate the door. They find out that it's made of a hard wood, and it's about 4 inches thick, and also reinforced with iron bands, which have begun to rust away at critical points. The barbarian figures, well, the door's about to fall off its hinges anyway, I'm going to make an entrance. He takes a good distance back, about 20 feet or so, lets out a ferocious battle cry, and charges forward. Of course, as DM, I ask him to make a few rolls, and we'll see how much damage it does to the door. And being a barbarian with a strength build, he does a phenomenal amount of damage after hitting it. So after crunching a few numbers and considering the physics and time, rust, wear, and tear, I can see no other logical conclusion other than that he knocks the door off of its hinges away from himself. So the barbarian charges forward, lets out this ear-shattering war cry, slams his axe against the door, and lands on his feet and admires his handiwork for just a moment, as the kinetic force of his attack against the door had forced the hinges to finally break free from rust and move away from him. The doors moved approximately 8 to 10 inches forward before coming to rest against the portcullis on the other side. This left me in quite a pickle as the GM because that was supposed to be the primary entrance. Open the doors, lift the portcullis, go inside. So now the group was left wandering around the front courtyard, finding a way inside, because now these giant heavy doors that weighed about 400 pounds each, they were resting against the portcullis in such a manner that they could not be wedged free. So with a little GM magic, they found an entrance that they could find a way into the Dollhouse, and did so. Now, part of the Dollhouse is that there's a NPC running around who's basically reactivating all the traps and making sure that the castle is ready for defense. This NPC happens to be a small rag doll that was once the familiar of the gnome wizard, who has become an awakened construct. The party, however, had actually made really good time, because the critical thing was the longer they took exploring the dungeon, the more traps that would be reactivated by the tiny guardian of the keep. So as they're going through, making really good time, they start avoiding the side paths, start just making a beeline right through it, and they're actually making really good guesses, until they come to another set of double doors. The barbarian gets this big old grin on his face, and he decides that he's going to try to take out these double doors. Whatever's on the other side is going to be scared witless, and they're going to get the advantage in combat. So I've got a hallway with 3 party members standing down on one end of it, and a barbarian running full speed, who leaps up, and again I ask him, make your attack rolls and everything, and once again he rolls phenomenal. So again, I have to consider a lot of things here. Unfortunately, the room that he had knocked the doors off of the hinges to, this time around, led into the main dance hall. At this point, the main dance hall, all of the traps had been reset by our little guardian, of course. So the doors fly off of their hinges, fly forward, and the barbarian, of course, has nothing to stop his momentum this time, also descends into the room. Unfortunately, there was about 6 traps in this room that were all sound activated. So the moment that these giant double doors hit the ground, it detonated all of the traps. A moment later, in some rolls, the barbarian comes walking out of the room, electrified, a little bit crispy, shaking his head in frustration, as now he has been turned into a walking slab of beef jerky. The rest of the party members had managed to make their rolls down the hall with some bonuses, given their distance, to avoid the effects of the traps. So this time only the barbarian was hit. After a little bit of healing from the cleric, the barbarian was good to go again, and they kept exploring the dollhouse. Mind you, at this point they had encountered many of the mechanical residents of the dollhouse. As with the theme of the keep, the doll maker himself would build small automatons that would cast spells. Whether they be small walking turrets that would cast magic missiles or flaming hands, the group was continuously swarmed by diminutive-sized dolls that would attack them with magical abilities. The barbarian was able to weather most of these attacks quite well, as so were the other characters. But still, the sheer numbers was the biggest deciding factor in most combat scenarios. And it really did get to the point where the group was starting to beat feet and try to get to the end of the dungeon as fast as possible. At this point, they decided to go down another hallway, and yet again, the barbarian sees another set of double doors. The player looks at me, he looks at the rest of the group, he's like, "Frell it. This time, it's gotta work out. If this works out like it did the last couple of times, I am done." I, as a GM, shrugged and said, "Okay, dude, do what you're gonna do." So once again, the barbarian charges down for the third time at a set of double doors. This time I asked him to make a reflex saving throw. And of all the things that hit the table, he rolls a 2. And he's a low-level barbarian, so his total comes to 3. So given his total, the speed of his momentum, he had no time to avoid the trap. So the rest of the group hears the barbarian charging down the hallway, screaming like a madman, and then nothing. Silence. The rogue finally takes point and starts slinking down the hallway, checking everything for traps, looking for anything that may be amiss, and finally comes to the very end of the hall, and right before the end of the hallway he finds that the floor is actually illusionary, and that there's a gem resting above the door that's casting the illusion, basically a permanent image stone. With some further investigation, he finds out that underneath the illusionary floor is a large, dark orb. Yes, it was an orb of annihilation at the end of the hallway, underneath an illusionary floor that the gnome had put there. I showed my notes to prove that the DC to defeat that trap was just a mere 5. Continuing with the saga of the dollhouse, the same group had fought tooth and nail to get to the very end of the dungeon. After the death of the barbarian, they continued to search the dungeon in a much more methodical and careful manner. They managed to make it past the physical realm and into a pocket dimension that was the gnome's safe haven. After traveling some ways into it, they had discovered a chest. This chest was the big loot box, as there was no loot in the rest of the dungeon. Upon opening the chest, they find dolls. Lots and lots of dolls, all themed towards the doll maker's chosen profession. He was a toy maker. He was also a wizard. And so, a quick mental gymnastics trip, they had assumed that this box of dolls, which were all immaculate and perfect, were in essence the treasure of the dungeon. It was at this point, and to my surprise, that the party members took 2 flasks of alchemist fire, dumped it into the contents of the box, and immediately had the sorcerer cast Spark.